guys, what's up? Welcome back to yet another week here at My Yummy Spatula. So we're doing things a little bit different this week. Instead of giving you a recipe, which I usually do, today I'm going to break down some of the must-have tools and equipment as a baker. This is such a huge, I wouldn't necessarily say problem, but I think confusion that a lot of bakers tend to have these days is that they feel they need to have all these 10,000 different fancy equipment to become a successful, skilled, confident baker. But that could not be further away from the truth, because you don't need fancy equipment to make you a skilled baker. Fancy equipment only help you in your journey, but they don't actually make you a skilled baker. Skills come from learning the technique and really understanding a recipe and understanding pastry and baking at a deeper level. Sure, KitchenAid will help you, but if you don't know the basic technique behind a recipe, you can use all the KitchenAids you want. It's not going to help you get the result that you're looking for, essentially. So yes, while tools are very, very handy to have in your baking pantry, cupboard, wherever you store them, it's not the end all beyond of everything. You still need to know the skills, you still need to know the techniques, you still need to have that understanding and knowledge of baking to help you become a good baker. Saying that, let's dive into some of the must-have tools as a baker, especially for somebody who's just starting out, or even if you're an advanced baker who has been baking for years. This is like a tool check that you can do to make sure that you do have everything in your baking pantry / cupboard. These are tools that I feel like every baker should have. These are not real fancy equipment. These are just basic tools that will really sort of help you elevate and finish your pastry skills. Like I said, it's not a substitute for actual skills, but they will certainly help you to make life a little bit easier. So let's get right into it. Just a disclaimer, I'm not including very basic tools like spatulas and whisks and baking trays and tins and all of that, because I'm going to assume you already know that. So this list is exclusive of those things, and this is more about building your sort of tool kit, essentially. So the first piece of tool that I would recommend for every baker to must have in their toolkit is a couple of different palette knives. Now these are offset palette knives because they have that little crank on them. You can have flat ones as well, especially if you're a cake decorator, but I am not a cake decorator, so I mostly only use offset spatulas with this crank, because my majorly aim of using palette knives is either to lift stuff or to temper chocolate or to sort of finesse things around a regular cake. So this is why having palette knives is very, very important, and having it in different sizes really helps to make it multi-purpose, because you can use different sizes for different sort of applications. So my smaller one I usually use for more delicate applications, so maybe if I'm finishing a small cake, or if I'm tempering a small piece of chocolate, or if I'm doing a chocolate decoration, or if I'm lifting really tiny petite stuff, or anything like that. So a small one is really, really handy. Next, I like to have this medium size. This is mostly for sort of spreading out cake batters and tuiles and a lot of that stuff, and it's also really handy if you have a medium-sized cake that you can sort of move around, so also finish on the sides and all of that. So that's why medium one is good. And it's very important to have the right grip for your palette knife so that you're very easily able to work it. You don't want a palette knife that is very sort of disproportionate to your hands. So I tend to have a smaller hand, so I like to have palette knives that are appropriate to my size, and I don't want a palette knife that's like that long. It'll be very uncomfortable for me to work with it. So having a good grip of palette knife is very important, so that you have a very sort of easy motion that you can work with. And this is the largest one that I have. I don't use this that often just because I find it a little bit more uncomfortable because of how long it is, but this is really good if I do have to handle something a little bit bigger, larger cakes and stuff like that, or something that's a bit taller as well. So this is good for those applications. So just having them in different sizes really helps to make it multi-purpose, and you can use it in a lot of different ways. So palette knife must have in your toolkit. Next up, this is my personal favorite, and I don't think a lot of people really understand the sort of utility of them, and those are scrapers. I love scrapers and I like to have a couple of different ones. So I've got plastic ones. This one is literally what I use for a lot of things. I use this to fold my macarons, I use this for my bread doughs, I use this to sort of spread stuff around. So it's really handy to have a sort of flexible plastic scraper that can do a lot. It's also really good to spread your cake batters or your fillings on top of cakes and then really smoothen it out. It's also really good to smoothen out sort of cake edges if you are a cake decorator. So very handy tool to have. I think it's very underrated as to what this can do. So one of my favorite things to use is a plastic scraper. I have them in small, and this one's mostly for cake decorating, so it's got a slightly sharper edge and it's quite sort of tall that I can use for my cake decorating, or you can use it for bread doughs and all of that. So very good investment to have, and they are extremely cheap, so you might want to stock up on a couple of different ones and sizes. I also like to have metal ones, so this is what I mainly use for my bread. So if I'm shaping stuff, if I'm portioning my bread, if I'm making pastas, anything, this is a super tool to have. It's very handy, even if you're making sort of tart doughs and pastry doughs and all of that. Very good and handy tool to have in your toolkit. This one is mostly a chocolate scraper, so this is to temper chocolate and do chocolate decorations and all of that. So unless you work with chocolate a lot, you probably don't need this, but because it's got a very thin sort of blade, I guess, because it's a chocolate scraper, it's also very handy to lift things that are a little bit more delicate, because this one has slightly thicker blade than this one. So I use this when I needed things to be more flexible because it bends a little bit more. So unless you work with chocolate, this is not that relevant to you, but definitely have a metal scraper with some sort of handle to make it sort of work easy for you. Definitely a couple of different plastic scrapers. They're extremely cheap and they come in super handy, so definitely a must have. Okay, actually I take that back. My personal favorite is this baby right here, and that is a weighing scale. Now, if you're somebody who's been baking for a long time, you might be a bit like, well, duh, you need to have a weighing scale. But I am genuinely shocked at the amount of people who do not use a weighing scale and just go by cups and tablespoons and those measurements. That is ridiculous. If you've been following me for 2 seconds, you know I don't give out recipes in cups and spoons and tablespoons and all of that, because that is an extremely terrible way to go about measuring your ingredients, especially when it comes to baking. So if you are somebody who's still using cups and tablespoons as measurements, you need to ditch that right now and get yourself a digital weighing scale, because this will change your entire baking game. You do not realize how precise baking is and how just a few different grams of something can really make a huge difference. And the problem with cups and tablespoons, all of that, is they're not very universal. A US cup is different to a UK cup, and same as like Australian cup. So it's different, and the way people measure stuff is also very sort of variable and different. So I might say one cup is 120 grams, somebody might say it's 128 grams, somebody says 130 grams. So which one do you really go with? So having a digital weighing scale really takes away all that variables and makes it very precise. It's 100 grams of eggs, whether you crack 2 eggs or you crack 2.5 eggs or you crack 4 eggs. 4 eggs might be a bit extreme, but it really sort of standardizes a lot of your ingredient measurements and just takes away any of that guesswork or just little human factor that can really impact your baking. So having a digital weighing scale is very important. I cannot emphasize on enough. And if you're like me and you do you work with gelatin or pectin and stuff like that has very sort of little measurements, it's a good idea to invest in a mini electric scale that sort of measures like real tiny amounts as well, so that you don't sort of end up overweighing or underweighing your little ingredients like yeast and gelatin and whatnot. So digital weighing scale, very important, must have. I think this should be the top of the list. We're just going to move this to the top of the list now. This is number one you need to have. Number 4 must-have tool in every baker's toolkit is a digital thermometer. This is such a handy tool to have, especially if you're somebody who makes a lot of caramels or meringues or I don't know, ice cream bases, anglaise, custard, literally anything and everything. A digital thermometer is such a lifesaver, and it really makes things very accurate and makes you sort of get consistent results each time, because you can't just rely on what is dark amber color. What does that even mean? Because for me, that might be a little bit darker, for you, that might be a little bit less. So it really sort of takes away that guesswork, because now you just have to cook it to a certain temperature, especially if you have a bakery operations where you make repeated sort of products, or if you have multiple people making the product. It really just takes away that inconsistency of relying on everybody's quote-unquote style, and making sure that everybody's doing the exact same thing and getting consistent results every single time with a digital thermometer. So very handy, especially if you do chocolate work. Very important to have a digital thermometer. You can have an infrared one as well, but I wouldn't really recommend that, simply because it only takes the surface level temperature. It doesn't take the temperature of actual food. So that's why a probe thermometer with this sort of stick is very handy to have. Definitely recommend to have a digital thermometer. Your life will change once you start actually using this one. So absolute must have. Number 5 must have tool. Well, this is not a tool, this is an equipment, but must have equipment in your toolkit are these rings, these metal rings that I use with no bottom. This is very handy. As you can see, I have a load of them in all the different sizes. I actually haven't taken out all of them. I do have a couple more different sizes as well. And this is so handy, especially if you're somebody who's interested in French pastry, because this is so multi-purpose, because you can use them for a lot of different stuff. You can use them to assemble your cakes in. So you literally just line it with paper or acetate, or you don't even need to line it, and just assemble your cakes in them so that you get a very nice round cake. You can also use them to assemble your entremets. You can actually bake stuff in them. Cheesecake, very sort of good to bake in them. You can bake cakes in them. You can sort of bake cakes and then cut them into these rounds, and that's what mostly every professional baker does. They don't bake it in actual rounds, they bake it in shapes, and they just sort of cut it so that you get multiple of the same thickness in one go. So very multi-purpose. I actually don't have a single, actually do have one baking tin, like a round baking tin with a bottom, but other than that, I don't even use that. This is what I use all the time, and they're very cheap, they're very economical, not too expensive at all, and you can have them in all different sizes, and then you can have such an amazing sort of array of offers that you can offer to your clients, different sizes of cakes and all that, and you can have some real fun assembling these entremets. You can do inserts and then do the outside mousse layer with them. It's very versatile, and it really does make life a lot easier. So I absolutely recommend having these metal rings in your toolkit. Number 6 must-have tool is a microplane, or a zester, if you will. This is very handy to obviously zest things, but it's also really good to grate stuff, even for cooking. Obviously, if you're cooking and baking, you want to have 2 separate ones, but you can even use this to grate garlic, grate ginger, obviously grate orange zest, lemon, any other citrus. You can use this, grate this. You can also use this to grate whole spices, so you get a really fresher flavor. So it's really handy to zest things, and it really gets all of that flavor from the rind without getting any of the bits, because of how sort of tiny this is. So very handy. It's much better than having like a box grater where the sort of grates are very big, so you end up getting a lot of the bit as well. So having a tiny microplane like this is very handy to add flavoring to your desserts as well as your cooking. Another piece of equipment that I would recommend every baker to have in their toolkit is an immersion blender. This is by no means a must-have, and you can absolutely get away with not having this in your toolkit, but honestly, the results that you're gonna see if you do have an immersion blender is mind-blowing. It's such a huge difference, and you really sort of get to see your baking go from amateur to professional, because an immersion blender really sort of gives you that great quality and great finesse to your product. So very good for creating emulsions, like even making a ganache but like not splitting it, or not making an okay ganache but making an absolutely mind-blowing ganache that looks glossy, is shiny, and has the most luscious velvety mouthfeel. And you can only have that with an immersion blender. So making like perfect ganaches, making perfect caramel, making perfect mousses, custards, gels, a whole lot of it. Immersion blender is a very handy tool, and this really sort of steps it up from being an amateur level baking to a professional level baking. So no means a must have, but if you can, I would highly recommend investing in one of these, because they are absolutely amazing. You don't have to go for a really expensive one. I do have Bar Mix, which is a decently very good brand, but you don't have to have something as expensive as this. You can start with something a little bit more cost effective. If you have Target or Kmart in your country or wherever you're from, you can just grab a cheaper one from there. That's how I started. It's not great, but it still does the job better than a whisk, right? So it's still a little bit of a step up, and obviously gradually down the line you can probably invest in getting a real professional one like Bar Mix or Roboku or something like that. But honestly, I cannot recommend this enough. This is an absolute lifesaver, and you are going to see the results for yourself. And it's also really great if you do sort of cook as well, so making emulsions like mayonnaise or hollandaise sauce or béarnaise or purees and all of that. It's really handy to do all of that. So really versatile, multi-purpose equipment that I think you absolutely should have in your baking toolkit. I have lost the number that we're on, but another piece of tool that I would recommend everybody to have is a pastry brush. And I don't mean that cheap plastic quality pastry brush, but a really good quality pastry brush where the bristles don't fall out like hair. These are great for your egg washes, to do like a sugar glaze on top, even to sort of get rid of any extra flour when you are working with pastries like tarts or croissant or puff pastry or something like that. Also really good for marinades. It has both baking and cooking applications, and having a pastry brush is just really handy to just dust off any excess flour or to just egg wash, and using a good quality one where the bristles are actually really soft and they bend really nice and easily, unlike the plastic ones, but they're quite hard and they end up destroying your product more than actually doing anything good to it. So having a good quality one, even just one pastry brush, but having a good quality one will last you forever. Like I bought this, I don't know, probably 4 years ago, and it's still in perfect shape, and it's very handy. This one is from Matfa, so just get one good quality pastry brush and that will last you for a long time, and it's very convenient and handy to have, so definitely must have. And lastly, one of the biggest must-haves if you are a regular baker is a stand mixer. This one is a Smeg stand mixer. I also have a KitchenAid. You don't need to have two stand mixers by no means. But if you are a regular baker, I would highly recommend investing in a stand mixer, because these will make your life so easy. And it's not just about the ease of sort of convenience, it's also very multi-purpose. So you can use this paddle attachment to make your cake batters, your buttercreams, choux pastry, and a lot of different other pastry doughs. So very versatile attachment to have. This is not something that you have in a handheld beater. You only have the whisk and that weird hook looking thing, which, like, let's be honest, doesn't do a whole lot. So you don't have that paddle attachment in a handheld beater, and you can't end up doing a lot of things with that. So that's why having a stand mixer is very multi-purpose and has a lot more utility. So great paddle attachment. Obviously, you've got a whisk attachment that helps to sort of aerate stuff, so whipping your meringues or your cream or anything that you basically need to whip. Obviously whisk comes in handy for that, and while this is the only attachment you do have in a handheld beater, anything that needs to be whisked, you're okay, but other than that it's not very convenient that way. And lastly, it also comes with this hook attachment for bread baking, so very handy if you're somebody who enjoys bread making. As you know, a handheld beater does not have this particular attachment to make doughs in, and if you ever try kneading dough with your hands, you know what an absolute pain that is. So that's why having a stand mixer is very convenient and has a lot of utility involved as well. Like, I use my stand mixer on the regular pretty much every single day. I might not use both of them at the same time, but a lot of times I do, and I definitely end up using at least once a day. Like, that's the bare minimum. So if you are somebody who does enjoy baking on the regular, or you do bake on the regular, highly recommend having a stand mixer, because it will just change your entire baking game. Not even kidding. So definitely worth investing in one if you are somebody who bakes on the regular. And that was it. That was my personal recommendation for must-have tools and equipment in your baking toolkit. There are so many more tools and equipment that you can collect, and as a baker, that's one of the joys of being a baker, to be able to sort of use these fancier molds and tools and whatnot. But like I said, you don't need fancy equipment to be a good baker. If you cannot make a custard with the most basic of ingredients, you cannot make a good custard even with the fanciest of equipment. So that's why it's important to know your basics, really nail your technique, and then you can obviously level up. So these tools and equipment are enough to sort of get you going, get you off the ground, and really start working. And obviously, as you grow, you can keep adding to your collection and collect all those fancy molds and equipment and tools and whatnot. But yeah, that was all for my recommendation, and that was all for this week's video. It was a relatively shorter one, but I hope you enjoyed this and you got a lot of clarity out of this. If you did enjoy this, feel free to leave a like and let me know in the comments if you think there's something missing and should be added to the list as well. Please feel free to comment so that everybody else can sort of get the benefit of that as well. And yeah, that was it for this week's video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I will see you guys next week. Until then, happy baking. Bye.